Football still isn't coming home, but England's socially conscious team have done the country proud and potentially changed it for the better. Sadly, the same cannot be said for the minority of fans who, after the game, flooded the social media pages of free black players with racist abuse. On tonight's Tysky we'll be discussing the politics of England's remarkable Euro 2020 campaign, what it says about the country and its prospects for the future. To do so, I will be joined in one moment by Aaron Bastani. And of course, as ever, we want to hear from you as well. Do you think England's anti-racist football team have changed England for the better? Or do the racist comments directed at Saka, Sancho and Rashford show any attempt to create an anti-racist Englishness is a losing game? Let us know your response by tweeting on the hashtag Tysky Sour. If you're new to the show, hit subscribe. We'll also be talking in the second half of the programme about the latest on the loosening of coronavirus restrictions. A big announcement today in Parliament from Sajid Javid, and then also a press conference from Boris Johnson. First story, though. England's inspirational run in Euro 2020 ended in heartbreak last night as Italy won the final at Wembley on penalties. We can't show you those final moments of the game. That's for copyright reasons. We can't yet afford football rights. But here instead is the fan reaction to the moment 22-year-old Gianluigi Donnarumma saved a penalty from 19-year-old Bukayo Saka. Now, those looks of shock and disappointment were mirrored across England. I'm sure many of you watching this looked like that last night. Yet, despite the sorrow, I think the overwhelming mood across the country was incredibly supportive of England's play.
As much as we're devastated, we're proud of Saka and everything that he achieved and everything the team achieved.
It's a moment to remember. We got to the final. It's very sad, but we did our best, and
What would your message be to Gareth Southgate and the players?
Oh my God, we love you.
Yeah, we love
and you did us proud for those 30 or so years ago.
And Harry Kane went to my school, so I feel attached to him in that way. And I think it was just really unlucky. They went to penalties.
It's all about luck.
I think we thought we had it, but it's just very sad.
As I say, I think that is reflective of most people in Britain, incredibly supportive of a team who got that far and did it in a really honourable fashion. However, as I assume you know by this point, such supportive sentiments couldn't protect Bukayo Saka, Jadon, Sancho and Marcus Rashford, the three players who missed penalties from online racist abuse. Now, all three players received streams of racist comments and monkey emojis, really horrible stuff, leading to Saka suspending his Instagram account. I think that's live again now, but obviously it was incredibly upsetting for the man soon after that defeat. Also, we've seen a mural of Marcus Rashford, which was defaced in Manchester. That's now been covered with more positive messages. There's clearly, a big fight back against these racists as well. Now, these examples I've just given you, overt racism, everyone in mainstream politics across the political spectrum and across sport has been condemning it. I want to show you how Gareth Southgate responded to the abuse suffered by his black players.
We can only set the example that we believe we should and represent the country in the way that we feel you should when you're representing England. And everybody has to remember when they support the team that they also represent England and should represent what we stand for. So I think the players have done that brilliantly, and we can only continue to try to affect the things that we can, but we have, I think, had a positive effect on lots of areas of society, but we can't affect everything. Other people have responsibilities in those areas, and we've all got to work collectively to constantly improve those things.
It was a characteristically thoughtful intervention from Gareth Southgate. He's saying the players have set an example that's had a positive effect, but there's a limit to what they can do. I think we should all celebrate players taking the knee. He's basically saying you can't expect that to end racism in this country. You're going to have different institutions intervening to stop black players after an important match suffering abuse. When they've put themselves forward and taken a huge risk by taking a penalty in the final for England. Interesting there. I think he said, we can't do this on our own. I think we have Aaron ready now. Aaron, what did you make of that intervention from Gareth Southgate? He's essentially saying, look, we've done our bit, right? We've done our bit. We have put forward an anti-racist vision of England that has had some effect, but we can't stop this minority of players minority of fans abusing our black players. That's where other institutions have to come in. Potentially that's the government, potentially that's social media companies. What do you make of this?
It's a hard one. I think on the one hand, if you're playing sort of a devil's advocate here, you would say that footballers in the past have been villainized, demonized for doing the same thing. So one example is David Beckham after World Cup 98. He was sent off for a petulant foul, basically. One might argue he cost England the game. And in the subsequent season, first few games of the season, there were effigies of the guy. You could say the same about, players who've missed penalties and so on. They've sort of been demonized. What's changed is obviously social media. So the costs of being able to get to these people and say outrageous things to them has clearly fallen. And I think if Beckham had done what he'd done in 1998, I think he would have come in for a vociferous abuse. Clearly, with these guys, there's clearly a racial element to it, a massive racial element to it. I think it is important to say though, Michael, if these were white footballers, they also would have been abused. I think we shouldn't be under any illusions about that. Where I think there is something really important to say politically is, how many institutions, Michael, can we say in our public life where we have people who are, particularly black players, we don't have any, I don't think a Jewish person's ever played for England. George Cohen, who was in the 1966 World Cup, I think he had a great grandfather who was Jewish. I don't think we've had any British Asians play for the national side, but particularly black players who have a major role in professional football in this country, throughout the football pyramid and also obviously in the national team. This is one of the very few institutions where they're this prominent, where they play this large a role. And I think it's inarguable. Actually, people feel more disinhibited than anywhere else in terms of doling out abuse. So on the one hand, they would be getting, all sorts of vile comments, whatever the color of their skin, because people sadly treat, people with a public profile, footballers like that, when these things happen and social media has changed the rules of the game. At the same time, it's clearly happening within a broader context. And Michael, I think what's really important is, when you go back to say 2 weeks, a month before this tournament started, people were saying, maybe you and I weren't saying it, but people who were perfectly progressive were saying, oh God, maybe Southgate, maybe the England team will sort of step back and won't take the knee, and they don't want to be seen as overtly political. And actually they defied that and chose to do it anyway. And I think that's a really, really important choice they made. And in that sense, they've been completely vindicated. You absolutely have to stand up to these things. Yes, it shouldn't just be for a few games. It shouldn't be, oh, are we always going to do this? Yes, why not? Why shouldn't we always see this? The PFA, ultimately, it's the Professional Footballers Association. It represents those players. Many of those players are players of colour, and they clearly feel there's major problems, because there are, in the national game with regards to racism. And I think it's brilliant that we're having this conversation in a way straight away. Obviously, it's terrible that it's had to happen at all, but we should be under no illusions. Racism in football is a huge problem, And yes, okay, there's an element of this which is just social media. Many of these people won't be in the UK. Many of them will have multiple accounts, etc., etc. But my God, we all know this stuff happens in stands. We've seen this happen, and people getting pissed in pubs and bars when watching football. There was Julian Rubenstein, who said he came in for abuse because he had Rubenstein, a Jewish name, on the back of his England shirt. We know this happens, and I think it's really, really brilliant, frankly, that it's not just being given carte blanche or being called out, but actually it's front and center now of the conversation around the national game. Fantastic. That's really good. But, Michael, Bukayo Saka is only 19 years old, and it shouldn't be on the shoulders of a 19-year-old man to have to be at the crucible of this conversation, which we should be having as a nation. But that's really terrifying for him. And I think this may sound strange again for our audience, but Gareth Southgate ultimately chose a 19-year-old kid who'd never taken a penalty in professional football to take the most important penalty in the history of the English game, which is what it was. We didn't win on penalties in 1966. And I think that was irresponsible, because I think this was always going to happen. Gary Neville said this earlier on today. We'll probably show that clip. That the second he saw those three guys miss their penalties, important to say, actually, I thought Rashford's was actually an excellent penalty. He just got unlucky, hit the post. He knew what the conversation was going to be today. And I think for Saka in particular, you're 19. It's an appalling thing to have to go through at any age, but I think particularly for him, he's only had, 1.5 seasons in the professional game as a kid.
I want to go straight to some comments because we got some interesting ones. Ishtak with a tenner says, big up Saka and the lads. The team has achieved more in their short lives than these trolls and racists achieved in 100 lifetimes. Let them wallow in their own filth. I fully endorse that statement. We've got a question for Aaron. Kryptonium tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Aaron, you tweeted that the England team are defiantly anti-racist because their generation are increasingly and actively anti-racist, because slowly, step by step, the anti-racist struggle is being won from the bottom up. Do you still think so? Yeah, 100%. 100%. I don't think there's any doubts about it. I think the fact you've got a manager who is willing to line up and defend these players. I think the fact, for me, what summed it up, Michael, was when you've got Sam Allardyce on GB News. I don't know Sam Allardyce's politics. Maybe he's really radical. I don't think he is. But given his age, I thought the way he responded to the question about Black Lives Matter was really, really subtle, nuanced, attuned. And I think that really demonstrates as a profound shift in professional football. And it would be hard not to, right? Because this is a game where a disproportionate number of professional players, sadly not coaches, but professional players, are of Afro-Caribbean descent, heritage. And so the culture within the game, I think, is actually far more attuned to these things than, a lot of commentators and pundits seem to think, because it's working class people, like from Sam Allardyce all the way through to Gary Neville or Jamie Carragher, the sort of backgrounds they come from, obviously now very wealthy people. But I think the assumption is from sort of liberal intelligentsia, that they're not attuned to these conversations. Well, actually, when you work in an industry where, you might be in a team and of the starting 11, 5 or 6 of your teammates are people of color, maybe more, right? There's massive numbers of young fans are people of color. Then I think it'd be very hard not to be attuned to these issues. So I do think it's definitely improving. And you can almost see it kind of cascading down. I was talking about this earlier to a colleague of ours, Michael Gary, had a video. And for me, there's already a huge distinction between millennials and Gen Z in terms of their social mores on this stuff. And that's just a cohort of 10 years difference. If you think about the young players, the golden generation for England, Lampard, Gerrard, Rio Ferdinand, John Terry, Michael Owen, Rooney, all different ages. But that generation, Ashley Cole, that generation of players that came through, I think John Terry, for instance, what he did to Ashley Cole, wasn't it? No, sorry, what he did to Rio Ferdinand, my apologies, and Ashley Cole got him off the hook, said, what he did to Anton Ferdinand, rather, racist comments he made, I think that to me signified a kind of dying culture in football, which they'd inherited from generations prior to them. And I do think there's a clear and discernible difference in values between the current England team, generally 27 or younger, generally Gen Z, and even people in their late 30s, early 40s, right? People like Beckham, people like Neville. And Neville's got really good politics, or Jamie Carragher. But the way they conducted themselves when they were players, hugely different to this. And so I think, you'd have to be blind almost to not see a huge cultural shift in football. And we can have a conversation about that. For me, I think it's reflective of broader social changes, yes. Let's have a look at, I think, some more evidence that there are, whilst there are still, obviously, as we've seen, huge problems, there has been change, and that is down to, the struggles of people fighting against racism in football. First, I want to show you polling, which is from Opinion, and it's on the issue of whether or not people support or oppose England players taking the knee. Now, at the start of the tournament, there were already a majority who supported England players taking the knee, despite what right-wing pundits might say that, ordinary working class people hate this. No, the majority of the country have been in favour of this since the start of the tournament. And positively, that has gone up throughout the contest. So at the start of the tournament, there was 50% of people who supported taking the knee. That's gone up to 56%. And of people who oppose taking the knee, that's gone down from 37% to 32%. So you're seeing an increasing consensus that players expressing their support for anti-racist struggles at the start of matches is the right thing to do. Another thing I thought was interesting this morning was the front pages of the right-wing newspapers who were very used to, very comfortable promoting racist dog whistles, essentially. They chose not to this morning. So I want to show you the Daily Express. They went with "It hurts, but we're so proud of you." The Sun went with "Pride of Lions," and the Daily Mail went with "It all ends in tears," but they talked about the team as "lion hearts to the last." What this is showing to me is not that, you know, Britain's right-wing tabloids have suddenly converted to anti-racism, but rather that these are newspapers who, if they don't have any principles, one thing they do know is who their readers are. Right. And we know they are very willing to write headlines which are trying to encourage racism against black people if they think that's not going to damage their business prospects. But it seems to me clear in this situation that the Sun, Daily Mail, the Express, they could have lent into this idea that there were black players that missed penalties and they should have been focused on football instead of politics. Obviously, we're going to debunk why all of this is completely ridiculous in a moment. But they could have gone with that, and they've decided, no, actually, that wouldn't wash with our readers. And I think that does show some progress. Now, of course, none of this is to minimize the problem, because even if the racism we've seen online and in the streets, I mean, this is less documented, even if that's from a real minority of people, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a huge effect on black people in this country and black people in football. I want to go to a couple of tweets which I think really made this stand out to me, really hammered home this point. Now, the first is from Marvin Sordell. He's a former footballer, now producer and speaker. So he said on Twitter, "The saddest thing is that as soon as 3 black players missed penalties, we all knew exactly what was coming." You can see there how ingrained this is, how used to racist abuse black people are whenever a black footballer makes a mistake. You know, people always say when a black footballer succeeds, that's a victory for England. When a black footballer makes a mistake, that's the fault of them individually. And this is something people are so used to seeing, that people knew instantly when those players missed the penalty what was coming. The second one is from Jason Okundaya, who we've had on the show before. He's a writer. He shared a screenshot from his family group chat with his mum saying, "Evening all. If any of you are out, please get home early. I am begging you all. It is going to be rowdy and violent tonight. All missed penalties were by black players." Now, that's, I mean, a really, really heartbreaking thing to share. The fact that we still live in a nation where people are worried about their kids when black players miss penalties, I mean, is shocking. And however much progress we've had, while that is still the case, there is clearly a significant problem. It's also a significant problem when it's when this racist behavior by a minority is being boosted by people in power, which is the topic of our next section. Before we go on to that, if you're enjoying the stream, do hit that like button. The minority of fans who reacted to England's loss with racism have been condemned by people across the political spectrum. That includes the Prime Minister, who said this England team deserved to be lauded as heroes, not racially abused on social media. Those responsible for this appalling abuse should be ashamed of himself. Now, those condemnations of despicable abuse are, of course, welcome. It would be terrible if we had a Prime Minister who said, "Oh, no, I have good people on both sides, whatever." But do such condemnations ring hollow when they come from politicians who have pursued racist policies and made racist statements? Gary Neville thinks so.
Well, I'm just reading your breaking news. It says the PM condemns racist abuse of England players. Is that the same Prime Minister that a few weeks ago, I mean, Gareth Southgate and the players a few weeks ago, about 5 days on the trot, told us that they were taking the knee to promote equality and it was against racism. The Prime Minister said that it was okay for the population of this country to boo those players who were trying to promote equality and defend against racism. It starts at the very top. And so for me, I wasn't surprised in the slightest that I woke up this morning to those headlines. I expected it the minute that the 3 players that missed. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, there is an issue, obviously, in football. There is an issue in society where we feel it's acceptable, basically, to criticise players for sporting actions because of the colour of their skin. But I have to say, accepting and validating that players who take the knee, like I was saying, we're promoting equality, inclusion, and defending against racism, is coming from the very top. And that, you know full well that if your parents do something, your children will follow. And I'm not saying that each individual person who was obviously directed that abuse towards the players shouldn't take accountability. They absolutely should. The social media companies, we know full well now, it's a well-told story that the social media companies have to come down harder on racist abuse. I think we have to start to isolate these individuals who are attacking the players in a racist manner and isolate them by writing to their employers, so that ultimately there is total accountability and there is suffering and consequence. But also that, to be fair, there is consequence within the game through the FA, the Premier League and other organisations, UEFA and FIFA. And we start to see, sentences and punishments for these incidents that ultimately fit the crime, because people are being abused. And it's absolutely ridiculous in 2021 we're still talking about this, but we are.
So Gary Neville, they're saying this comes from the top. He mentioned in other interviews as well, Boris Johnson's comments about Muslim women looking like letterboxes. He's saying we have a racist culture which comes from the top, essentially, which is very different from what's being put forward by, for example, Boris Johnson, who's saying this is just a minority of people who need to crawl back under a rock. Aaron, I want to get your thoughts on this. Do you think Gary Neville's right to say that this comes from the top?
Yeah, I think 100%. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think it would be a more interesting conversation if you didn't have somebody like Boris Johnson as the Prime Minister. And if you made that same point about how Britain, because of course then the conversation becomes incredibly abstract, doesn't it? But when you've got a figurehead like a Trump or a Boris Johnson, Johnson is not as bad as Trump, but he's still pretty bad, then I think it personalizes things and it makes it much easier to sort of say that and say, look, these aren't a few bad apples. These aren't isolated incidents. Actually, they reflect a far deeper structural problem. And I think, in a way, and this might seem quite harmless, Michael, but I think you can kind of look at the problem through the prism of how Harry Kane was on most front pages of most newspapers the day after England played. Now, of course, England didn't lose any of their games in normal time. So, you always had a good front page the next day, had a great tournament. But for me, I don't think Raheem Sterling or Harry Kane played particularly well last night because they were up against two of the best centre-backs in the world. But for me, actually, Raheem Sterling had a much better tournament than Harry Kane. I thought he was probably... Harry Kane still had a very good tournament. I thought Raheem Sterling was really exciting. I thought he was really working hard. He's not had a great season with Man City. I thought he was brilliant in this tournament. I think if England won last night, I think he would have been in the team of the tournament, him and Kane both up front. And yet, how many times do we see Raheem Sterling on the front page or the back page of a newspaper? Not often. Generally speaking, it was Harry Kane, and he was seen as the talisman of this England team. And let's be honest, that's because his name is Harry and because he's white. Raheem Sterling is a very telegenic guy. He's very affable. He has a really good, amazing story. And yet he wasn't seen as the talisman. And the simple reason for that, Michael, is the fact that he's black and Harry Kane is white, in my opinion. And so I think, yes, that may just seem harmless. It may seem that, oh, come on, Aaron, that's ridiculous. Some people might think that. But I think that does show you the fact that clearly we are talking about something quite structural here and quite profound. And there are lots of people, Michael, in the mainstream media who, for instance, when you had Burnley fans during the Premier League season, there was a flyover with a plane, and I think it was like All Lives Matter over a game, protesting Black Lives Matter. There are a lot of people in the media, Michael, who think, yeah, that's right. They're fine to do that, or they're entitled to do that. And that's, I don't think that's acceptable. And I think that's where you say there's at the very least a culture of permissibility. So on the one hand, I think it's true. You've got somebody like Boris Johnson who says outrageous things, and I think that shows a real problem. But I think for me, the broader cultural problem within the media and the political class per se is permissibility. How many people on the right in this country would stand up and say, no, that isn't acceptable? No, when you've got a pitch and 50% of the players on the pitch are black and they're involved in an anti-racist movement, which started because a black guy was killed by a police officer, and they all know the reality of living with racism day in, day out, and some fucking idiot, excuse my French, pays for a plane to go over the top and say all lives matter, basically saying, piss off. I don't, I haven't got the time of day for what you've had to live through. I think clearly that has to be universally condemned, and it wasn't. Right, it wasn't. And so I think for me, the big problem is the permissibility. And this is where we end up, right? This is where we end up. And I think that's the key takeaway that we sort of have to impress over the last 24 hours. If you have a culture of permissibility, if you allow people to say things and get away with things and claim things, which frankly do allow and enable and facilitate a culture of racism, this is where we finish. A 19-year-old guy on Instagram being called all manner of outrageous things by anonymous trolls. That's where we end up. And so I think permissibility is the key word for me.
I mean, someone who has encouraged that permissibility is, of course, Priti Patel. She weighed in on the abuse suffered by players, saying, "I am disgusted that England players who have given so much for our country this summer have been subject to vile racist abuse on social media. It has no place in our country, and I back the police to hold those responsible accountable." Now, this Priti Patel, who is now speaking out against racism in football, is the same person, the same Home Secretary, who said only a couple of weeks ago that fans have the right to boo players for taking the knee, and that she doesn't support the anti-racist protests of footballers because she sees it as gesture politics. Now, as we've shown you earlier in the show, actually, those players taking the knee has had a material impact on attitudes to race and racism in this country, which is probably why the Tory parties weren't in favour. They, of course, don't have any opposition to gesture politics. They do it all the time, right? That's what clapping for the NHS was, while offering them a real terms pay cut. That's what Boris Johnson was doing when he was standing with all of those flags outside Downing Street. These are people very, very comfortable with gesture politics. They're just uncomfortable with anti-racist politics. Yet they're all crawling out from under their rocks to condemn the consequences of their giving permission to racism. Labour have come out and pointed out some of the hypocrisy of this. Deputy Leader Angela Rayner tweeted, "Let me be clear, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary gave licence to the racists who booed the England players and are now racially abusing England players. Boris Johnson and Priti Patel are like arsonists complaining about a fire they poured petrol on, total hypocrites." Now, I think in terms of party politics, what you have seen over this tournament is the Labour Party have discovered, oh, look, actually, Gareth Southgate, he's doing something which is potentially consistent with what we want to do and people like him, so we're going to lean into it. Keir Starmer obviously was not capable of coming up with his own inclusive version of patriotism. I would imagine he would have sat on the fence when it came to taking the knee. Obviously, he did it last summer. Since then, he's been a bit more lukewarm when it comes to Black Lives Matter. But Labour now leaning in now that Gareth Southgate has given them permission. We're going to go to a couple more comments. Although, actually, the Burnley stunt was worse than All Lives Matter, Aaron. It was White Lives Matter. I have been informed. Anne Hayfield with a £5 donation says, "I love you guys, but I'm fed up of hearing about football. Is there nothing else going on in the world?" Well, I'm going to push back against that, because I do think that this is a huge cultural event, this competition, and the England team have been absolutely extraordinary in terms of making this politically relevant. So I think it is very much something we should be commenting on. We have one more football story, and then we're going on to coronavirus. So if I haven't convinced you with that comment about football, just wait about 8 minutes. Aaron, you want to come in briefly on that comment?
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously got a bit from Angela Rayner there, but not from Keir Starmer. He did do a clip. People can go and watch it on Twitter. And what's really interesting for me, Michael, is that the way that Gary Neville talks about the issue, succinct, to the point, and he's basically saying what Keir Starmer says in his own clip, but Keir Starmer kind of speaks in this really strange, multi kind of syllable legalese, and you're not quite sure what he's saying. You need to have gone to university to understand what he's saying. And it kind of really brings home to me the fact that somebody like Gary Neville, who just speaks in the kind of idiom of everyday people, he would probably be a better politician. That's not to say Gary Neville would solve everybody's problems, but it's really interesting for me when you have a politician who just seems so, just rhetorically, so distant, and you have a former footballer. I mean, in a way, of course, it makes a whole world of sense. Who actually just gets straight to the point in terms of how they talk. Gary Neville should maybe do some media coaching for Keir Starmer, Michael. He's a Labour supporter, so why not?
Yeah, that could definitely be helpful. Peter Harrison tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. One side, young POC who have the guts to step up and take pens in front of millions, knowing that if they miss, they're going to get a whole load of shit. The other side, the people giving them that shit don't even have the guts to own their vile opinions enabled by the government. Again, nothing to disagree with there. Our final football story for the evening. Oh, 1 second. Here we go. Marcus Rashford has been a thorn in the side of the Conservatives with his campaigns to feed hungry kids. Yes, that is something our governing party are averse to doing. Now, that context meant that right-wing pundits were quick to jump on the opportunity of Rashford missing a penalty to have a dig at a footballer. One of those was Darren Grimes. He tweeted, "Honestly, though, Marcus Rashford, penalties, not politics from now on, eh?" Now, that was an incredibly unpleasant response from a professional Twitter troll. It got ratioed on social media. It didn't go down very well. And we're not going to go through all of the reactions. I just want to show you one response, which is pretty indicative of the attitudes of most people to that comment from Grimes. This is Novara Media's very own James Butler. He responded, "Rashford is an internationally acclaimed athlete who has changed thousands of children's lives for the better in his spare time. You're a grifting parasite reviled even by those on your own side. Shut your mouth." Ouch. That tweet, by the way, got a lot more likes than Darren Grimes' original one. Of course, Grimes is someone whose whole career is based on creating these controversies, soiling himself in public for attention. We aren't going to spend a segment talking about him. However, the reason this is relevant is because while the likes of Darren Grimes expressed this publicly, there were people in positions of much greater significance who were thinking the same thing and saying it privately. Now, one of those was Conservative MPs Natalie Elphicke. Now, this is a leaked message to a Tory WhatsApp group. So Natalie Elphicke said, "They lost. Would it be ungenerous to suggest Rashford should have spent more time perfecting his game and less time playing politics?" That's basically exactly what Darren Grimes was saying, but she's saying it in private. Now, the watermark you can see there is because this tweet was leaked to GB News. Aaron, my question for you is how much separates those sitting on the Tory benches from, the nastiest trolls on right-wing Twitter? They're obviously not brave enough to say this publicly, but they're saying it. Well, this isn't even privately, is it? Because it's to all the other Tory MPs. It's not just being whispered under her breath.
Yes, it's clearly a spectrum, isn't it? Look, I think this is an important thing to say, Michael. Marcus Rashford is famous and he earns lots of money because he's a good footballer. So, of course, his priority should obviously be being a good footballer. But when you're a footballer, you have a lot of spare time, like a lot. You need time for recovery. You can only train so many hours a day. You're only maximum playing 2 games a week. There's only so much football you can do, right? And so you have lots of time to recover. And what this has been sort of historically is that you get lots of young men, too much time, too much money, developing addiction problems. Keith Gillespie developed a gambling problem. There's one memorable example, Tony Adams with alcoholism. And this is a repeated theme. And even people who didn't develop gambling addictions, gambling was rife. You hear of some of the stories, for instance, with the England teams in the early 2000s, of some of the gambling debts they owed each other from playing cards. You have lots of spare time. And what Marcus Rashford has decided to do with this spare time is to basically help the most vulnerable, the most exploited, the left behind people of this country, young kids that can't get school dinners. He's done his book to inspire young people to read. He's tried to, and he's been successful in, changing government policy on a range of issues that have really affected low-income people, again, particularly kids. And so that's how he's decided to spend his time. Now, I wonder, do Tories and Tory MPs and this lady here, Natalie Elphicke, was it, Michael? Do Tories like this, would they rather you have a footballer like Keith Gillespie, too much time, too much money, developing addiction problems which destroy their lives? Or they could be like Marcus Rashford, and it should be said other footballers too, by the way, he's not unique in doing this, who say, I have this spare time, I have these resources, most importantly, I have a profile where actually I can change things for the better. And Rashford's been very honest about this. He said, look, I might only have 10 years of fame, right? I mean, in all likelihood, that's what will happen. 20 to 30, maybe a bit more if you're lucky, but 10 years of fame. And he wants to use it for social good. And the reality is, Michael, sadly, that Tory MPs like Natalie Elphicke would rather he becomes like a Tony Adams, develops an alcohol addiction, or a Keith Gillespie develops a gambling addiction, than actually do something positive and political. And it should be said, what he's doing is very political, Michael. He's playing a very active role as a citizen in the country's politics. They don't want him to do that. And so this nonsense that you got from Natalie Elphick, but also from Darren Grimes, that he needs to focus on penalties and not, poverty or politics, it's crap. They don't know what they're talking about. They're snobs who, an original idea in regards to football or actually public policy or actually just helping other people has never entered their heads. So Marcus Rashford is the third fastest Man United player in the Premier League era to reach 50 goals after Wayne Rooney and Cristiano Ronaldo. Darren Grimes still has his mum do his cleaning because he lives in her basement. So, when it comes to these points, I think it's important to say, Darren, a few ideas should kind of stick in your brain. One is stones, another is glass houses.
Anyway, I want to get back to Natalie Elphick because, as I say, she's the most significant person here. She, I assume, on learning that her private WhatsApp message was about to be leaked, put this tweet out publicly. So she said, "Last night, I shared the frustration and heartbreak of millions of England fans. The team gave their all. Congratulations and onwards to the World Cup." Now, why I think this is a particularly pathetic tweet from this Tory MP is that first sentence. "Last night, I shared the frustration and heartbreak of millions of England fans." And why I think that's just so cowardly is because she's doing what these right-wing, ideological, vicious conservatives like to do when they are, essentially dismissing or abusing black players, which is to say, oh, what I expressed, you might find it objectionable, but ultimately I'm just expressing the will of millions of good, honest people in the country. Now, that's just not the case here, right? I mean, what we see from polling here is that people are overwhelmingly supportive of Gareth Southgate and what he stands for. They're overwhelmingly supportive of the England football team. They aren't annoyed that Marcus Rashford is standing up for hungry kids. They're incredibly supportive of it because the extreme opinions of Natalie Elphick, which is that this incredibly articulate, brave footballer should stop trying to feed hungry kids, right? When she says that, she's not representing millions of people in this country. She's representing a really vicious minority whose influence is massively over-exaggerated because we have an incredibly right-wing, billionaire-owned press, right? So this idea, I was just sharing the frustration and heartbreak of millions. No, you were just showing yourself to be the reactionary, vicious bigot that you are. That's my bit on Natalie Elphick. And we're going to move on to COVID-19. Before we do that, we do have some news about the show. We've told you this before, but I do want to emphasize it because we're so excited about it. We are currently hiring another member of our production team. So we're expanding the Tysky team. As I've said before, this is because of your kind donations. We're going to be building the show, potentially making it more often, improving the quality, everything. And we want your ideas to make that happen. So if you are interested in the role, do check out the details on our website. If you think you have the qualities we are desiring, then do get in touch. We really do encourage you to apply. The link to do so is in the description of this video. Let's move on to COVID-19. As we prepare to drop a new load of restrictions on the 19th of July, the Tory government has been giving out a lot of mixed messages. This is no more the case. And on the question of masks. Now, to jog your memory, this was Community Secretary Robert Jenrick on Sky News on the 4th of July when he was asked if he would be dumping his mask on the 19th of July.
Well, like many people, I want to get away from these restrictions as quickly as I possibly can. And we don't want them to stay in place for a day longer than is necessary. We are going to, I think, now move into a period where there won't be legal restrictions. The state won't be telling you what to do, but you will want to exercise a degree of personal responsibility and judgment. So different people will come to different conclusions on things like masks, for example. And the Prime Minister will set out more detail on the national policy on some of those restrictions in the coming days.
So that was just a week ago. The following day, Boris Johnson laid out plans for July the 19th. They scrapped mask mandates in any and all settings. Now, during that week, I think probably most shockingly, actually, government spokespeople were asked, so what if businesses want to introduce a mask mandate? If they say you can't come into this supermarket without a mask, if Tesco or the London Underground decided that, and they said, oh, well, they'll have to check if that's consistent with equalities law, to suggest that actually the government is not going to protect any institutions from introducing their own mask mandates unless it discriminates against people who don't want to wear masks. Right. So it was really an incredibly irresponsible policy, also completely nonsensical to say, oh, you should just take, you should make your own judgment about the personal risk you are willing to take. That's ridiculous because, as we've been told throughout this pandemic, you wear a mask not to protect yourself, but to protect other people around you. So the idea that you'd make a personal risk assessment doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It was a stupid policy. Thankfully, then, it seems there has been a bit of a U-turn on this front. 7 days after generic said masks are just a personal choice, which is dependent on personal risk, the vaccines minister, Nadhim Zahawi, went on Sky News to say this.
The guidelines that we'll set out tomorrow will demonstrate that, including guidelines that people are expected to wear masks in indoor enclosed spaces, and of course to remain vigilant with hands and face and to just remember that if we all act responsibly, as we did with the vaccination program, the nation came together to vaccinate. 80,000 vaccinated volunteers came forward, out of retirement and to vaccinate. We can come together and deal with this pandemic in a way that is responsible by thinking about our own actions and how they impact other people, including, of course, people who are maybe immunocompromised.
Now, that message from Nadhim Zahawi is much better than the one from Robert Jenrick, right? It happens to be the complete opposite of what he said, but, the government have clearly got to a slightly better position. They're saying you should wear a mask for other people. They completely abandon this idea that it's based on individual risk and the risks you are willing to take as an individual. He's also brought up immunosuppressed people whose vaccines might not have been that effective because their immune systems don't function as well as one would hope, right? That's sensible, what's being said there. So what prompted this change? It's an interesting question. It could be scientific advice. Often when the government have changed policy throughout this pandemic, they've said, oh, the science have changed. The science has changed. The problem there, the science hasn't changed here. They've been saying the same thing the whole time, which is that you need to wear a mask to protect people around you. And also the idea of getting rid of mandatory masks on the 19th of July is ridiculous. This was never a policy which was endorsed by scientists, as you saw actually in press conferences last week, where Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance stood next to Boris Johnson and said they'll still be wearing masks in public places, in indoor public places. What then does explain the shift? Now, it might not come as a surprise to you that it seems to be that the Tories got cold feet when they found out that the public weren't particularly keen on the policies they'd just put forward. Essentially, they were worried it was going to damage them electorally. I want to show you some interesting polling, which I think essentially explains this change of tune. It's from YouGov. They asked members of the public whether they thought face masks should continue to be mandatory on public transport after the 19th of July. 71% said yes, they agreed it should be mandatory. Only 21% thought it should no longer continue to be mandatory. So the Tories, by saying that all of these mask mandates will end, they found themselves radically out of step with the public. We can also see here in shops. So when it comes to shops, 66% of the public thought that masks should continue to be mandatory in shops. Only 27% thought that should be dropped, that masks should not be mandatory in shops. Worth saying, actually, the government is still out of step with the majority of the public here, because they're still saying it's voluntary. They're now encouraging it instead of saying, oh, it's up to you. But what the public want, and what the scientists essentially want as well, is to say, look, let's just keep masks in places such as the tube and in places such as shops. There's literally no reason to get rid of them whatsoever. I think personally it's going to reduce freedoms if you have people not wearing masks in shops, because they'll say, no, we can't have the government laying down these diktats because people need to be able to make their own choices. I think what's obviously the case here is that forcing people to wear masks on the tube really, really, it's not a meaningful freedom to be able to not wear a mask on the tube. I mean, it's slight. I don't want to downplay it. It's a slightly meaningful freedom to be able to go on the tube and not wear a mask. But more important is to be able to go on the tube and not worry about getting COVID-19 because someone is not wearing a mask, right? So I think net freedom's definitely increased by people wearing masks on tubes. The government didn't think so. They seem to be coming round to that, but only because the public disagreed. For me, this has real echoes of the whole, the shit show essentially, which was the government's herd immunity policy. They said, look, the sensible thing to do here is to let everyone get the disease, to let it run riot. It turned out the public didn't like that. Exactly the same things happened here. What Sajid Javid wanted to do is say, I'm now the health secretary for Tory backbenchers. That means I'm going to get the public used to COVID-19. We're going to have a policy where we let it run riot so that we can move on. The public have spoken. They, unsurprisingly, don't want that. People don't like the idea of encouraging a disease, which we still don't know that much about, to circulate in an unrestrained, uncontrolled way. I want to move on to today because in Westminster, we got further news about what to expect after the 19th of July. Sajid Javid spoke to MPs. He introduced what those policies would be from that day onwards. And he said this.
Mr. Speaker, as we make these changes, it's so important that people act with caution and with personal responsibility. For example, everyone should return to work gradually if they're currently working from home. They should try to meet people outside where that's possible. And it's expected and recommended that people should wear face coverings unless they're exempt in crowded indoor settings like public transport.
So he's saying there, instead of last week when he was talking about putting COVID behind us, everyone needs to go back to work, we should learn to live with it. He's now saying, actually, you should take some precautions. Even if the legal demands are falling away, you need to take social, personal measures to try and limit infection. It's a significant change in tone. It's a welcome one, even if it wasn't a change which was done for particularly impressive reasons. They were worried they were going to get punished at the ballot box. It does, however, so this policy of saying we're going to get rid of all mandatory measures, but we're going to ask you to use your own judgment. This does leave a lot of ambiguities. What are we supposed to do? The nightclub is open, but am I supposed to go to it? Right? I don't have to wear my mask in the supermarket. So if I find it really annoying, am I allowed to say, look, some people don't really mind wearing the mask, but for me, I find it particularly annoying. Are you allowed to not wear it? How do we make this assessment that we're all supposed to do? What is the common sense in the situation, which will be in place from the 19th of July? Well, all of these questions, I think, were put very well by Chris Smith from The Times in today's Downing Street press conference. Let's go to that.
I think what we want to do is get people to think carefully about the ending of the restrictions that we're announcing today, and to make sure, in the immortal words of JVT, Jonathan Van Tam, they don't rip the pants out of it or tear the pants out of it, I think is what he said ages ago. And I think I said last week, don't be demob happy about this. This is not the end of COVID. It requires constant vigilance. It means thinking about others as well as yourself. It means thinking about wearing a face covering in confined spaces where you meet other people that you don't normally meet, as I've said, as we said earlier on, and we said last week. It means continuing to think about the risk of transmission to the shielded, the extremely vulnerable, how you behave with them in their presence. Obviously, exercising common sense, because the legal restrictions have come off, should not be taken as an invitation by everybody simply to have a great jubilee and freedom from any kind of caution or restraint. That's what we're saying, and I think what the scientists are saying is this is the right date, or as good as any other date to do this, but it's got to be taken seriously, and we've got to go as slowly as we can, given the constraints we're under. And I think that, for me, that makes a great deal of sense. If we held off till September, if we waited, to go for the legal unlockings that we are, then we'd be doing it, as I said, in a context of a great deal more risk from the weather. Plus, we wouldn't have the advantage of the school holidays and so on. This is about as good a time as any, but to do it properly and sensibly, everybody has got to be cautious.
So my apologies, we actually included the wrong part of Chris Smith's question there. The question that we saw Boris Johnson there answering was much more about those ambiguities. What should people do? The club is open. Should they go to it? You saw there Boris Johnson's answer. He also, interestingly, went on to this point, which there does seem to be agreement about from most scientists who are close to the government, which is that the decision in terms of releasing restrictions now isn't whether or not we will have a rise in hospitalizations or none at all. It's whether we will have what they call, an exit curve as we leave the lockdown now, or if we do it in September. The advantages of doing it in September is that there'll be more people double vaccinated. The advantages of doing it now is that it's in summer, so it doesn't coincide with people in schools, and it doesn't coincide with the beginning of winter. So it's a difficult one in terms of should we be loosening restrictions at all. But yeah, this isn't one of those situations where the government is doing something which is obviously terrible. They are when it comes to masks and things like that. When it comes to should we have any loosening of restrictions, I think less so. I do want to go back to that question of how people should behave, though, after the 19th of July. It's politically interesting. It's also practically useful for us to all have an idea of how we should be making decisions after the 19th of July. Unsurprisingly, the answers from Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance were more constructive than those from Boris Johnson. So let's take a look at their answer to those questions.
I don't think that the things which are going to make a difference will come as any surprise to anybody in the UK over the next period. The things that we've all been doing for a long time, people have been incredibly good and incredibly patient at doing it. The hands, face, space thing, wash your hands, cover your face in crowded areas, avoid crowded areas where you can, avoid unnecessary meetings, but be sensible on it. And above all, the thing which is new, get yourself vaccinated. It protects yourself, it protects your family, it protects everyone around you. These are the things that people have done very steadily. And as the Prime Minister has said, the fact that we can move from working at home doesn't mean that we should rush at it. Everything should be done steadily, and it's really a message about going steadily, and that's what people have done all the way through this. They've been incredibly good at it, actually all the way through across the country and all four nations, and that's all we're really saying is carry on being steady.
Can I just add two to that? One is the absolute necessity to continue self-isolating if you test positive. Very important to stop spread, and if you're symptomatic, get a test. And in reopening, make sure that ventilation gets a priority. So summer is quite a good time to do that, to obviously make sure windows are open and there's sufficient ventilation in buildings.
That was very good advice. Chris Whitty essentially saying, wear masks, etc. Vallance saying the most important thing is here, if you are sick, get tested. And if you do have COVID, self-isolate. I think that's something that actually hasn't been emphasized enough by the government, because I think a lot of people are now thinking, if I'm in contact with someone with COVID-19, they're telling me it's not the most dangerous disease ever. Do I really have to take 10 minutes out of my life because I might possibly have it? I mean, the messages here are getting ambiguous, and I think understandably it's reasonable that we might think that self-isolation for 10 days shouldn't be used in all circumstances now, given that it's a less deadly disease. But it's really important people don't start seeing this as just like the common cold, where if you've got COVID-19 but you feel okay, you can go out and about. Also ventilation, something that Boris Johnson has never properly emphasised, but Patrick Vallance clearly recognises the importance of. I just want to bring up one final change, and before going to Aaron on his thoughts on these new announcements, which is on vaccine passports. So you will have known from previous shows that a review led by Michael Gove found that vaccine passports would be unnecessary. So a vaccine passport, this is the relevant point here, is not for going abroad. We know that they're going to be introduced. It's more for going into big events, nightclubs, etc. Will you have to prove that you've been vaccinated to get in there? Now, the review from Michael Gove found that would be necessary during the summer. It seems to have been a bit of a U-turn there. Obviously, that review was before the Delta variant started spreading. Today, Javid announced that venues will be supported and encouraged by the government to use the NHS app to check the vaccination status of attendees. So it's not going to be mandatory, but clubs will be encouraged to do it. So it's quite likely that if you try and go to a nightclub this summer, you might be asked whether or not you've been vaccinated. Aaron, I want to go to your general thoughts on the announcement today, and I suppose especially what you think about this U-turn on vaccine passports.
Yeah, the vaccine passport thing is interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's just sort of creeping in. I think you're right, Michael. I mean, it's important to say I do agree with the ending of restrictions. I will still, however, be wearing a mask in enclosed spaces. I think going into, even if they weren't mandatory, for instance, in pubs and restaurants as you go in, I don't see really what the harm or the downside is in doing that. I think perhaps even people might, in the longer term, this might sort of create some of a cultural reset during the winter months. If you don't want to get flu, cold, you go on the tube. Even if COVID-19, which isn't going to happen, completely disappeared, I think that would be a smart way to behave. So it is kind of, it is an interesting one. And I don't quite understand. Maybe you can explain this to me, Michael. What's the obsession with not wearing masks? It doesn't seem a particularly onerous thing to have to do. You cannot wear a mask on the bus or the train. For this to be like the generating, guiding idea behind your politics, I don't really grasp it. You can, by the way, if you're on the train, you can eat, you can drink, right? And you take your mask off and then you put it back on again. Or if you have a health issue, you don't have to wear a mask. What's the big problem, Michael?
In terms of what sections of the population see it as a big problem, not many people do. The overwhelming majority of the public are happy to wear a mask on public transport and would prefer other people to do so. But the people, who have an ideological opposition to masks, I think, it's kind of cranky people. It's people who never thought COVID was a big deal, and so discover their libertarianism when it comes to these arbitrary restrictions, even though they're perfectly happy to have a very strong state when it comes to crime and punishment or things that would never affect them. They're basically affronted that they have had any intervention which they have to follow, which everyone has to follow equally. They don't like that kind of intervention. When it comes to what Sajid Javid was thinking in terms of getting rid of these masks, my theory here is that Sajid Javid entered that role and his key aim was to say, we need to get the public used to getting COVID-19. We need to get the public to have an attitude where one cannot really avoid getting it. So let's go back to normal. Let's treat COVID-19 like the common cold. So he wanted to, as much as possible, get rid of all the visual signifiers that were in the middle of a pandemic. And obviously, one of the key visual signifiers that we're in a pandemic is the mask. So he wanted to get rid of the mask and say, everyone, pandemic's over. Forget about COVID-19. If you get it, you get it. Think about it like a cold. And that's why he was so obsessed with removing that mask mandate. What's happened since then is that the scientists have come and said, look, if you don't even have masks, there's going to be an absolute nightmare. The public have also said, we don't care about masks. This just seems wildly irresponsible to us. Sajid Javid has basically realized that you can't at this point persuade the public the pandemic is over, because it's not. And the public aren't actually very ignorant about COVID-19. We know a lot about it now. The vast majority of the public know a lot about COVID-19. You can't suddenly click your fingers and lie to them and say the pandemic's over. So they've done a U-turn on that policy. The idea that we can snap our fingers and suddenly no one cares about COVID-19, that policy's over. That's why it's a little bit like that U-turn we saw in March 2020, where the government's policy was to say, we need everyone to relax and get used to the fact that some of their families are going to die. Some of their family members are going to die, and to just move on and take COVID on the chin. And then they discovered that's impossible, so they had to do a complete U-turn. The same thing is happening here. They tried to do herd immunity Mark 2 in a sort of forget about the virus, let's just let it happen. People didn't like it. They should have learned by now. I don't really know why they thought that was ever plausible, but to me, that's why that U-turn has happened.
But Michael, I mean, that was a policy choice. It was a ridiculous policy choice, herd immunity. But it does feel with Sajid Javid on this and the mask obsession that it is purely, and you're saying it's a signifier about this thing being over. I think I agree it's a signifier. But for me, it's just a signifier of this like abstract neoliberal idea of freedom. I think I don't really, because they're incredibly cheap. They're quite effective. Like you say, people like them. They have no impact on the economy. I don't really, unless it is just this abstract sort of, this is a guy, by the way, I'm sure our viewers already know this, but he's, Sajid Javid reads, Ayn Rand to his wife every year. This is somebody who is an intellectual, ideological, neoliberal. They don't think the state can do anything. And I think, in a way, because by the way, we have lots of constraints in life, right? If you go on the train and you go not wearing underpants, you're going to get done for public indecency. There are lots of constraints in life, and I think there is a part of his sort of politics, this Randian politics. Quite frankly, he would quite like you to be able to sort of go on a train and not have to do anything. You can say what you like, do what you like. And I think for me, Michael, and because we're coming out of this, we forget this. But this pandemic, the last 18 months, has just been a sledgehammer to that whole idea of politics, of sort of Randian, ultra-libertarian politics. And because we're coming out of it now, I think we can probably talk about that a bit more. And I think we should be able to look back on that. The last 45 years of, this whole ethics and politics and way of being, and say, what the hell was that about? Not only does it not work, not only does it not make sense, but it ends in obsessions about the most ridiculous and strange things, like not wearing masks. After, in this country, 130,000 people have died. The death knell of neoliberalism, the death knell of Ayn Rand. That's what we should be saying, Michael. As we come out of this, we go, what the hell were you thinking for the last 40 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the Julia Hartley-Brewer position here. I do think that Sajid Javid, it's more cynical in a way. I think it's less honest, because I think essentially his priority is we need to get the economy back to normal, back to how it was before, because we don't want to normalize government intervention. So he wants us all to flood into the bars so that no more support is needed, flood into the nightclub so that no more support is needed, flood onto the high street so that no more support is needed. He thinks that so long as we think there's a pandemic going on, we're not going to do that. I think his worry was there'd be some cognitive dissonance if you went on the tube with a mask and then you took off your mask to go to a restaurant or a bar. People say, well, if I'm not safe on the tube, why am I safe in the bar? He wants to get those numbers back to normal. So his theory was, well, we'll just take masks away from everywhere. The problem was he discovered that actually that wasn't going to get people to flood into the bars because they thought the pandemic was over. That was just going to mean that people wouldn't even go on the tube. So they completely misunderstood where the center ground of public opinion was on this one, and they've U-turned because of it. Again, as I say, that's why it's a bit like that herd immunity U-turn that we saw in March 2020.
So you think policy? I just think it's pure Randian ideology nonsense. But we'll have a bit of a nuanced disagreement on that, I think.
Yeah, I think we can. I don't think that's going to be a clincher. There's not going to be a split in Novara because I think it's for the economy and you think it's because of a Randian obsession. Let's go to a couple of comments. Or first of all, a thanks to Mary Dwyer, who donated a £10 super chat. And then Rob Hogg with a tenner, who says, even if your only priority is the economy, masks still make sense since that bozo blathering of freedom. Our local hardware shop has had to close and an eatery cancel an event because of COVID. That's something that's been said throughout the pandemic. I suppose to play devil's advocate or to slightly defend the government's position when it comes to the fact that COVID cases are going to increase, they're saying if we allow COVID cases to increase now, then we're going to get essentially some form of herd immunity, both by vaccinations and top-ups of infections. If we really suppress COVID now, then we'll just have those same peaks and that CAF will have to close in September. In a way, that's beyond my pay grade to quite understand or explain to you why that's an inevitability. But this does seem to be something which the scientists are fairly confident in at the moment. There will be an exit wave, and we are making a decision about whether that will be in July or whether that will be in September. Let's end the show for now. Aaron Bastani, it's been a pleasure as always.
It has been my pleasure, Michael. I just want to say, by the way, because I missed the start of the show, it gave me an even greater appreciation for what you do, Michael, the fact that I had to host a show last week. You are a consummate professional. You're only getting better. And I think it's fantastic. We're going to 5 days a week, and you're going to be hosting almost all of them, which is obviously a huge ask of you. But I think you're ready to step up, Michael. And that's what the last week taught me.
I very much appreciate those comments. I have to say, my one regret today is that I was hoping that I'd come back from my week away incredibly refreshed. I've actually come back from my week away incredibly hungover because of England making it to those finals. It would have been worse if they'd won, I have to say. For now, thank you for everyone for your super chats tonight. If you want to support us directly, then you can go to novaramedia.com/support. I'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. So make sure you hit subscribe. And tomorrow, Ash Saka will be talking to Juliet Jakes on how art can fight transphobia. That will be at 7 p.m. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be taken over to that stream when this show ends. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.